Chapter 12, The Socialization of Human Intelligences Through Symbols. Findings from biology and from anthropology stand at opposite extremes in any theory of human cognition. From study of the structures and functions of the nervous system, we should ultimately be able to specify certain limits on all human cognitive activities. From study of all known human cultures, we should eventually gain the fullest possible notion of the range of abilities, including thought processes, that have evolved over human history. By culling insights from these domains, we should receive a composite picture of the nature, the range, and the limitations of human intellectual prowess. But from the perspective of interdisciplinary synthesis, biology and anthropology are too remote from one another. In other words, our two principal perspectives in this book do not partake of the same language. Biology furnishes a picture of human genetic potential, as well as an account of the structure of cells, the synaptic connections, and the relatively molar regions of the brain. Anthropology ferrets out the different roles that exist in various societies, the various functions that individuals perform, the circumstances under which these functions are carried out, the goals that individuals set, and the problems that they pose and attempt to solve. So far as I can see, there is no ready way to build a bridge directly between these two bodies of information. Their vocabularies, their frames of reference are too disparate. It is as if one were asked to build a connecting link between the structure of a harpsichord and the sound of Bach's music. These entities are incommensurate. The domain of symbols, as it has been constituted by scholars, is ideally suited to help span the gap between the aforementioned entities. The nervous system with its structures and functions, and the culture with its roles and activities. In dealing with symbols like words or pictures, with symbolic systems like mathematics or language, with symbolic products like scientific theories or literary narratives, we have commerce with entities and levels of analysis that can address both biology and anthropology. Specifically, the nervous system is so constituted that, provided with certain kinds of experience, the organism is able to learn to apprehend and deal with such symbolic entities as words, sentences, and stories. For whereas the nervous system knows nothing of culture, its various regions are constituted to know a great deal about language. On the other hand, a culture, viewed here as the collectivity of inhabitants, is indeed able to examine the words, stories, theories, and the like that issue forth from its members. Thus, anthropomorphized, the culture can evaluate these products, determine whether they are adequate, observe or advise changes, opt for tradition or for revolution. Those individuals most directly charged with the maintenance of cultural knowledge and tradition may know nothing of brain cells, or even of the role of the brain in cognition, but they are well equipped to know and to evaluate the dances, dramas, and designs fashioned by members. The realm of the symbol does indeed provide an indispensable level of analysis, an essential tertium quid between the constraints of biology and the range of culture, or, if one prefers, between the range of biology and the constraints of culture. It is through symbols and symbol systems that our present framework, rooted in the psychology of intelligences, can be effectively linked with the concerns of culture, including the rearing of children and their ultimate placement in niches of responsibility and competence. Symbols pave the royal route from raw intelligences to finished cultures. It is therefore necessary to comment on how one might envision this realm. I take a Catholic view of symbols. Following my mentor Nelson Goodman and other authorities, I conceive of a symbol as any entity, material or abstract, that can denote or refer to any other entity. On this definition, words, pictures, diagrams, numbers, and a host of other entities are readily considered symbols. So, indeed, is any element, a line no less than a rock, so long as it is used and interpreted as representing some kind of information. In addition to denoting or representing, symbols convey meanings in another equally important, but less often appreciated way. A symbol can convey some mood, feeling, or tone, once again, just so long as the relevant community chooses to interpret a particular symbol in a particular way. Thus, a painting, whether abstract or representational, can convey moods of sadness, triumph, anger, or blueness, even if the painting itself is red. By including this important expressive function within the armament of a symbol, we are able to talk about the full range of artistic symbols, from symphonies to square dances, from sculpture to squiggles, all of which have potential for expressing such connotative meanings. Symbols can function alone as meaningful entities, but very commonly they enter as components or elements in a more highly elaborated system. Thus, words figure in spoken or written language, numbers and other abstract symbols in mathematical languages, gestures and other movement patterns within dance systems, and the like. And a considerable range of meanings can be effectively conveyed when entire symbolic systems are used. Mastering the deployment and the interpretation, the reading and the writing of such symbol systems constitutes a major task for every growing child. Finally, symbols and symbol systems gain their greatest utility as they enter into the fashioning of full-fledged symbolic products. Stories and sonnets, plays and poetry, mathematical proofs and problem solutions, rituals and reviews, all manner of symbolic entities that individuals create in order to convey a set of meanings, and that other individuals imbued in the culture are able to understand, interpret, appreciate, criticize, or transform. These symbolic products are the ultimate raison d'etre for symbol systems, the reasons they have come to evolve, and the reasons that human individuals go to the trouble of mastering diverse symbol systems. Is there any limit on symbol systems, or can any conceivable set of elements be organized into systems, thereby yielding interpretable symbolic products? This is a difficult question. It seems almost self-defeating to posit a priori a fixed number of symbol systems, which cannot be altered. This stricture constitutes a challenge that is almost too inviting, and doubtless a clever individual or an enterprising culture can invent an effective new symbol system. On the other hand, one risks opening a Pandora's box and arguing the opposite, in claiming that there can be an indefinite number of symbol systems. One would then have to explain why cultures the world over have tended to devise and favor the same kinds of symbol system, and why it is headline news in the anthropological community when effective new symbol systems are uncovered. If one has indeed specified the nature of human intelligences, the raw materials for cognition, on the one hand, and the range of human cultural roles and functions, on the other, one ought to be able to generate a list of all possible symbol systems, and, if you like, all the domains in which human beings can become intellectually engaged. It would be a long list, because the number of cultural roles is large indeed and may continually be expanded with the invention of new technologies. But, at least in principle, it should be possible to come up with an exhaustive list of symbolic systems. Such a list, or even a sketch of such a list, would be suggestive to educators, for it would indicate something of the possible systems of meanings that individuals growing up in a culture might be expected to master. Of course, the introduction and mastering of symbolic systems is not just a matter of theoretical speculation. It is a major burden of childhood, and might even be regarded as the principal mission of modern educational systems. It is therefore important to consider what is known about the way in which human beings become accomplished in the symbolic realm. Accordingly, I shall summarize the story of symbolic development, as I have come to view it, based in part on the findings of other workers, in part on the results of a decade of research by Denny Wolf and other collaborators at Harvard Project Zero. Such a survey will serve a double function. On the theoretical plane, it will point the way toward an integration of a biologically based view of intelligence. On the one hand, with an anthropological inventory of various cultural roles on the other, then, turning to more practical concerns, a discussion of the normal course of symbolic development should introduce some of the challenges that face educators. These steps should place us in a better position to consider various pedagogical suggestions put forth in the concluding chapters of this work. According to my analysis, it is useful to think of the development of competence with symbol systems as entailing 4 distinct phases. During infancy, the child acquires certain basic understandings on which later symbol use will piggyback and comes to evince capacities for certain mundane symbolic activities. During early childhood, a period of incredibly rapid advance spanning the ages from 2 to 5, the child acquires basic competence in a range of symbol systems. This is also the time when there are at work 2 parallel aspects of symbolic development, which my colleagues and I have termed, respectively, the waves and the streams of development. During school age, having achieved some basic competence in symbolization, the child goes on to acquire higher levels of skill in certain culturally valued domains or channels of symbolization. This is also the time when he masters various notational or second-order symbol systems, those that prove extremely useful in carrying out complex cultural tasks. Finally, during adolescence and adulthood, the individual can become a fully competent user of symbols, one who is able to transmit symbolic knowledge to younger individuals and who has at least the potential for fashioning original symbolic products. Infancy. Aided by various examples drawn from my own work, I can now take a closer look at these steps of symbol development and begin to consider how they relate to the major themes of this essay. Starting with infancy, we know that the newborn child has available a relatively circumscribed set of skills and abilities through which he comes to know the world. Schemas like sucking and looking. At first, these are brought to bear upon every available object, but very soon the child learns to direct certain activities to certain objects, sucking nipples and shaking rattles, while avoiding those activities in cases where they are less productive. Here we see the first examples of meaning becoming attached to behavior. The child pursues those activities that, for him, have come to be connected with pleasurable experiences, as well as those activities that lead to outcomes that he desires. In this, he is regularly aided by the interpretations adults confer upon his behavior and by the situations toward which he is guided or away from which he is warned by adults. The child achieves certain basic forms of understanding during the first year of life. He comes to appreciate that individuals can carry out certain roles with associated behavior, like shopping or feeding. That events have consequences. If you throw the bottle, it will fall on the ground. That there exist categories of objects, like dolls or flowers, that should not be confused with one another, and the like. These understandings are important for negotiating one's way around the world of persons and objects. In addition, they constitute an initial introduction to many facets of experience that will ultimately be expressed via diverse symbolic means. A history of the first year of life can also be written in terms of the initial operations of specific intelligences. As we have already seen, the child is able to carry out numerous operations specific to each intellectual domain. He can recognize differences in pitches and tonal sequences, commonalities among tokens of the same phoneme type, the numerosity of small sets of objects. He comes to appreciate the structure of the space around him, the use of his body to gain desired objects, the characteristic behavior patterns of other individuals, and his own set of customary reactions and feelings. Indeed, considerable progress occurs within each of these separate intellectual domains during the first year of life. Yet just as important are the ways in which these intelligences come to interact with one another. Smooth reaching requires the intercalation of spatial abilities with bodily activities. Searching for hidden objects requires the linking of logical, mathematical, spatial, and bodily capacities. A feeling of anxiety when the mother leaves or a stranger comes upon the scene involves the connection of intrapersonal and interpersonal forms of intelligence. Finally, we see a combination of intelligences at work in the first forms of proto-symbolic behavior, detected toward the end of the first year of life. The ability to appreciate the meanings of single words, and the ability to read pictorial depictions of objects in the real world. The child of one is able to respond appropriately to words like mother, cookie, or doggy because he can both make the proper linguistic discriminations and link these envelopes of sound to objects perceived in the world and to actions or feelings characteristically associated with those objects. By the same token, the child is able to appreciate the linkage between a depicted form and an object in the real world, an object that again features a whole range of perceptual, motor, and affective associations. By virtue of these capacities, the child is able to enter for the first time into the world of public meanings, and he will build upon this baptism into the symbolic realm in the many additional symbol-using tasks that lie ahead. The child from 2 to 5. During the following several years of life, epoch-making events occur in the child's symbolic development. The ages of 2 to 5 mark the time when basic symbolization develops, when the child becomes able to appreciate and to create instances of language, sentences, and stories. Two-dimensional symbolization, pictures. Three-dimensional symbolization, clay and blocks. Gestural symbolization, dance. music, songs, drama, pretend play, and certain kinds of mathematical and logical understanding, including an appreciation of basic numerical operations and simple causal explanations. By the close of the period, the time when children in our society enter school, they possess an initial or first draft knowledge of symbolization. They may then go on in the years that follow to achieve fuller symbolic mastery. An intuition for the several steps involved in the acquisition of such first draft knowledge of symbolization can be gained from the following example of the child at play with blocks. Given a block, the 1-year-old will simply place it in his mouth, knock it against a surface, or throw it down. Nothing symbolic is going on here. Symbolic activity of a mundane variety begins in the perceptual realm, as the child can relate the block to a picture of a block, or can hand over a block when requested to do so. Give mommy the block. An important next step in block use occurs around the age of 2, when the child is able to pick up 2 blocks, to announce one block as the mommy and the other as the baby, and then to have the 2 blocks take a walk. At age 3, the child can take a number of blocks, place the smaller ones atop the bigger ones, and declare, "This is a snowman," or "This is a pyramid." At age 4, the child is able to use the blocks in a numerically precise way. For example, building a staircase in which each column has one more or one less block than the abutting column. Finally, at age 5 or 6, the child can, for the first time, exploit the various squiggles on the side of the blocks in order to compose simple words like catty or confirm simple number facts like 2 plus 4 equals 6. Our analysis of such events that occur predictably during early childhood has turned up a number of factors at work. These are, respectively, the streams, waves, and channels of symbolization. In their manner of operation lies the key to symbolic development during the preschool years. First of all, there occurs a progression that is unique to each particular symbolic system. In language, for example, there is a lengthy evolution of syntactic capacities, from the ability to concatenate a pair of words at the age of 18 months, to the ability to speak in complex sentences, to pose why questions, and to utter passive constructions by the age of 4 or 5. This progression occurs exclusively within language and has few, if any, direct ramifications in other symbol systems. Hence, it can be thought of as a separate stream in the child's evolving family of competences. In music, much of the activity involves working out the basic relations to pitch that obtain within a scale. In blocks, the basic stream-like challenge entails an understanding of the dimensions of extent, contour, and continuity that enter into and regulate the construction of buildings and other architectonic structures. In number, the core activities involve an understanding of the operations of +1 and -1, and the growing capacity to coordinate these operations with the knowledge of basic numerical sets, and so on for each remaining symbol system. It seems legitimate to think of this stream-like development as the articulation of a particular intelligence once that intellectual capacity has become susceptible to involvement in, or appropriation by, appropriate symbol systems of the culture. Thus, the core aspects of musical intelligence, pitch and rhythm, are marshaled by the symbolic aspects of music, such as expression, this is a happy piece, and reference, this alludes to an earlier section of the song. In the case of language, the core syntactic and phonological aspects come to express certain kinds of meaning. For example, a string of words describes an agent carrying out an action that has consequences, and to create certain kinds of effect. For example, a certain plot conveys a scary aura. In drawing, the working out of spatial relations in 2 and 3 dimensions enters into the depiction of objects and sets of objects in the world, including ones that are farther from, overlap, or are smaller than another object. Here, in each case, a once raw and unmediated intellectual competence is being marshaled by an available symbolic vehicle in order to allow the realization of the symbolic potential of that particular competence. An intelligence developing properly after the first year of life necessarily intermeshes increasingly with various symbolic functions and systems. Indeed, only in brain-injured or autistic individuals does the intelligence continue to unfold in pure or raw form, untouched by a symbolic envelope. But there is another equally intriguing aspect to symbolic development, an aspect that runs concurrently with its stream-like or encapsulated aspect. I refer here to certain psychological processes that we call waves of symbolization. These sprawling processes typically begin within a particular symbolic realm, but by their very nature spread rapidly and sometimes even inappropriately into other symbolic domains. As an initial example, take the wave of role or event structuring, the ability of the 2-year-old child to indicate that an action has been carried out or a role occupied by an agent. The normal symbolic means for expressing such meanings is through words, mommy sleep, Fido jump, or through pretend play, the child puts a doll to sleep, the child loops a toy stethoscope around her neck. Language and pretend play are the proper loci of event structuring knowledge. We find, however, that this psychological process does not remain simply within its proper symbolic realm. Rather, whatever the symbolic domain of a given task, the child of this age is likely to import event structuring means. Hence, given a marker and asked to draw a truck, the child may instead grab the pen, rub it alongside the paper, and say, vroom vroom. He has transformed the marker into a truck, and his actions serve to recreate the sound and feel of a vehicle in motion. Or take a task in which the child is asked to select that block that resembles a toothbrush. Paying scant heed to the long cylindrical block, the child will simply grab the next available block, whatever its shape, and place it in his mouth, pretending that the block is a brush. Once again, the structure of the role and the event have taken over. A second wave, which we call analogical or topological mapping, comes to the fore about a year later, at approximately the age of 3. In analogical mapping, the child's use of the symbol captures, within the actual symbolic vehicle itself, some relations originally observed in the field of reference that he is symbolizing. And so, for the first time in drawing, the child becomes able to extend 2 appendages from the base of a circular form and dub the resulting form person. Or the child is able to place several blocks atop one another and declare the resulting form a snowman. The symbols bear an analogic resemblance to their reference. In a perhaps related development in the realm of music, the child can capture such analogic relations as whether the target song goes up or down, becomes faster or slower, but cannot capture the exact pitch or the metrical relations. Given the sprawling nature of a wave of symbolization, the child also uses a relational form of symbolization, even in circumstances where it is not appropriate. Asked to match the number of elements in an array, he will note whether there are many or a few, but will not fix the values with proper precision. Or asked to retell a story with several characters, he will reduce the protagonist to 2 individuals, one representing good, the other representing evil forces. The proclivity for capturing relative sizes, shapes, or valences proves an all-encompassing wave at this point. A succeeding wave occurring around the age of 4 explores the other side of the coin. Riding this wave of digital or quantitative mapping, the child is now intent on getting the number of elements in an array precisely correct. No longer does the child settle for rough approximations of the number of toes on a foot, of characters in a story, of pitches in a song. The child now gets his quantities just right. However, even this apparently beneficent advance exacts its cost. Rather than capturing the feelings and mood of a particular form of behavior, the sense of a person running in a dance or in a drawing, the child may be so intent on depicting the movement exactly correctly that crucial aspects of tone and nuance can be lost. After all, sometimes the qualities of a referent prove more important to capture than the quantities, particularly for aesthetic purposes. There are important points associated with the appearance and the proliferation of these wave-like capacities. First of all, each of these waves goes on to have a further history. For event structuring, analogical mapping, and digital mapping each figure in later life. We might think of the novelist, the sculptor, and the mathematician as adult masters of the 3 wave capacities just described. But perhaps more germane to my purposes, the wide scope of the waves indicates that certain symbolic processes, whatever their origin, are not inviolably tied to a particular domain of symbolization. Instead, they become available as more general coin, to be exploited appropriately or inappropriately by a much wider range of symbol systems. I touch here on a crucial aspect of human intellectual powers. Whereas most animals possess some computational capacities that are highly developed, consider song in birds or dances in bees. These competences are almost invariably encapsulated. That is, they remain rigidly restricted to a certain avenue of expression. In contrast, human intelligence is far more flexible. Given a new and valuable ability, humans have a much greater proclivity to deploy that ability widely, to try it out in remote symbolic domains, and to see whether it flies. Indeed, we humans may not be able to resist experimenting with certain newly evolving capacities, even where they are not entirely appropriate. In the end, human beings become supple symbol users because of our ability to mobilize those operations that prove peculiar to one symbolic domain, as well as certain versatile operations that lend themselves to deployment across a range of symbolic domains. The relation of the waves of symbolization to autonomous intelligences poses a difficult problem. Whereas the streams map comfortably onto our initial intelligence, the waves by their very nature do not respect the boundaries that demarcate intellectual domains. My own view is that each wave of symbolization originates within one intelligence. Thus, event structuring is most closely tied to linguistic intelligence, analog mapping to spatial intelligence, digital mapping to logical mathematical intelligence. However, for reasons that are not yet clear, powerful forces operate to guide these symbolic waves to remote intellectual realms. Having negotiated the three waves during the period when the individual streams of development continue to unfold in several symbolic domains, the child of 5 indeed has attained a first draft knowledge of numerous symbolic products. He knows what a story is and how to spin a short but suitable one. He exhibits comparable knowledge about songs, plays, dances, designs, and numerous other symbolic products. Indeed, this age is often described as a flowering of symbolic activity, for the child enthusiastically and effortlessly can produce instances in each of these symbolic domains. Moreover, these examples often strike the observer, at least in our aesthetically permissive era, as novel, charming, creative, and original. The child is able to express himself freely without undue critical apprehension, and has no commitment to producing just what others have fashioned. He is willing to transcend boundaries, to link domains, to effect unusual juxtapositions, in short, to exhibit some of the experimentation and flavorfulness that we associate with the mature artist. It is a heady time. Yet a new ensemble of symbolic processes is also beginning to come to the fore. These processes emerge spontaneously, at least in our society, when the child begins on his own during a game to make little counting marks on a piece of paper, or when asked to go to the store and purchase a dozen items, the child tries to invent a simple notation to aid him in his task. At around the age of 5, 6, or 7, children become capable of notational symbolization, the capacity to invent or use various notational systems that, in second-order fashion, themselves refer to basic symbol systems. There is written language that refers to spoken language, the written numerical system that refers to spoken or otherwise symbolized numbers. There are assorted maps, diagrams, codes, musical, or dance notational systems, each of which has been devised in order to capture salient points of a symbolic display. We might consider this new development the final and most decisive wave of symbolization. Notational symbolization differs from earlier waves. First of all, the capacity to create notations is a second-order capacity. It features a symbol system that itself refers to other symbol systems. Notationality thereby opens up possibilities of a most happy but unanticipated sort. Now the child can continue to invent symbol systems of an ever higher and more complex order, which take a previously mastered notational system as their referent. Much of mathematics and science is built upon this recursive possibility, where a third-order system can refer to a second-order system, and so forth. Perhaps most important, the hand of the culture can be seen with crystalline clarity at this point of symbolic development. Whereas the streams and the waves of earlier years have an endogenous quality and may well be observed in roughly comparable forms across the cultures of the world, notations clearly come largely from the surrounding culture. Hence, they constitute channels of symbolization, means of codifying information that have evolved within a given culture and are now furnished directly to the younger learner. While the inclination to invent notations might well be present even in individuals who live in societies with scant notational practices, it seems probable that only individuals who live in societies with many channels of notation will go on to use notations regularly in their own lives. Here may lie one of the principal differences between schooled and non-schooled societies, and hence between the kinds of individuals each characteristically produces. Once he becomes enwrapped in a world of notations, the child is bent on mastering new systems and using them in a precise and prescribed way. The child is now engaged in earnest in obtaining the symbol skills of his culture, and in a sense, the fun is over. The child attends especially to the symbolic channels favored by his culture, be they the dances in a ritual or the language in a historical textbook. And, correlatively, he comes to ignore those symbolic potentials that are neglected within his own culture. Whereas until this time, much of the mastery of symbolization has taken place in an informal, almost invisible manner, the learning of these explicit notational systems typically occurs within a formal setting, and oftentimes in an actual school. It is hardly an exaggeration to assert that education, as the term is used today, refers to the processes whereby children are introduced to and come to master the principal notational channels of their culture. At least within our own society, there is an intriguing, if somewhat discouraging, cognitive corollary to the advent of notational symbolization. In his zeal to master certain symbolic systems, the child often becomes extremely literal-minded. He wants to use the symbol system just in the proper way, and so will brook no deviations or experimentation. In fact, figurative language, unusual juxtapositions, and other departures from the conventional are out. This banishment makes the child's work seem prosaic and drab, in contrast to the freer, if more idiosyncratic works of earlier years. But this literal stage may well constitute an essential aspect of symbolic development, and it would be a radical pedagogue indeed who would attempt to circumvent or subvert it altogether. Perhaps one must master the symbolic system, as it is supposed to be mastered, before one can take fresh advantage of it. And indeed, most adults seem content simply to gain some competence in the major symbol systems of their culture, and to make sure that their youngsters achieve similar, or perhaps greater competence. There is in most populations little interest in innovative uses of symbol systems in departures from the status quo. It is given to only a few individuals in most cultures to reach the apogee of symbolic competence, and then to move off in unanticipated directions, experimenting with symbol systems, fashioning unusual and innovative symbolic products, perhaps even attempting to devise a new symbol system. Through this rapid survey of the highlights of symbolic development, as they have emerged in the research at Project Zero, I have attempted to suggest the way in which the raw intelligences come to be exploited and absorbed in the devising and the interpretation of symbolic products. Thus, in infancy, there may be instances of the raw intelligences, but these are almost immediately enwrapped in meaningful activities as a result of their effective consequences for the young child, and in light of the rich interpretations perpetually supplied by the surrounding culture. Then, during the preschool years, each intelligence is increasingly involved in the mastery and the deployment of diverse symbol systems. During this time, some aspects of the development of symbolic competences respect the boundaries of an intelligence, proceeding along relatively confined streams, while other aspects are likely to overrun the boundaries between intellectual domains in broad waves. Finally, during the period of notational symbolization, the culture itself intrudes, as various channels provided by the culture come to exert an ever greater effect on the child's symbolic practices and achievements. By this time, the dynamic within an individual intelligence must somehow have become intermeshed with the agenda of the culture, lest the child engage in activities that, from the culture's point of view, are unproductive, if not frankly autistic. Indeed, most individuals become so caught up in the mastering of the symbol systems, as defined by the culture, that sparks of original creativity remain in only a small minority of the population. The study of the developmental course of human symbolization has barely begun, and essentially all research has been conducted from the perspective of behavioral science. Yet, with my interest in the biological basis of cognition, I shall risk a few speculative remarks. First of all, it seems apparent that participation in the symbolic process is part of the human condition. Humans are as prepared to engage in symbolic processes, from language to dreams, as squirrels are prepared to bury nuts. It would take extraordinary pressures to keep an organism, raised in a cultural setting, from becoming a symbolic creature. As a second point, the forms and kinds of symbolization in which humans participate may also be guided by biological processes. While clearly there exists a wide range of symbolic roots, and cultures can conjure up fascinating and unexpected symbolic complexes, it seems likely that the main avenues of symbolization, the main forms of symbol use, and our trio of streams, waves, and channels are also courtesy of our species membership. A final point concerns the rhythms of symbolic development. In my view, there is a period of relatively great flexibility or plasticity during the first years of symbolic development. At that time, one has many options for the exploration of particular symbolic systems, the devising of unusual symbolic combinations, or the actual transgression of symbolic boundaries. This period may be likened to the phase of early plasticity found in a range of biological systems in a range of organisms. At the same time, there may also be sensitive or critical periods when involvement with the stuff of particular symbolic systems is particularly crucial, and failure to become involved especially costly. Correlatively, within and across cultures, particular triggering events or crystallizing experiences may guide individuals down particular symbolic paths. The growing reluctance to experiment with symbol systems in late childhood may reflect a decline of flexibility and plasticity, paralleling the increased rigidity found elsewhere in the processes of biological development. Just why a select group of individuals can retain or recapture the flexibility of early childhood remains one of the most puzzling of all dilemmas in the biological domain. While it has proved possible to indicate certain ways in which the individual intelligences continue to develop during the periods when symbolization comes to the fore, it is important to underscore once again that certain aspects of development do not fall easily into the pure intelligence mode of analysis. I refer, for example, to various amidal or cross-modal forms of representation, which may not respect the boundaries among intelligences. From the first months of infancy, it will be recalled, infants display some abilities to link information across diverse sensory modalities, and even to recognize abstract qualities like continuity, intensity, height, and the like, which are encountered across diverse intellectual domains. Similar kinds of modal sensitivity may well enable the child during the period of basic symbolization to effect mappings across diverse systems. And during a later childhood, such amidal sensitivities may spur the development of more general analogic or synthetic powers that can prove extremely important for creative output. Thus far, for reasons spelled out in the previous chapter, I have resisted the impulse to label these capacities as a separate amidal or cross-modal form of intelligence. But it is important that they not be omitted from any consideration of the trajectory of human symbolic development. Even as we should allow the possibility that symbolic development may involve abilities that resemble neither streams nor waves, we must keep in mind the powers of the individual intelligences. As we saw in earlier chapters, linguistic intelligence will emerge even in individuals deprived of the normal auditory-oral channels of communication, just as spatial intelligence will emerge even in individuals blinded from birth. Such findings provide powerful evidence that intelligences are sufficiently canalized, in the biological sense, as to be manifest even in the absence of normal spurs to growth. To be sure, intelligences may well be funneled by cultures to extremely diverse ends, but ultimately it is unlikely that the most basic human potentials can be altogether distorted or stifled. I have so far intimated a consensus within the community of developmental researchers on the issues of symbolic development. In a way, this portrait is permissible because the number of researchers plumbing this area is very small, and the initial task of charting has itself consumed most of our energies. Moreover, it is fair to say that most of the researchers have been strongly influenced by Piaget and therefore find it natural to espouse a view of development as occurring in stages. Still, it is likely that any discussion among students of symbolic development would uncover significant disagreements and tensions as well. Consistent with my project of subjecting MI theory to discussion and criticism, it is appropriate to indicate where some of these tensions might lie. First of all, while many authorities see learning as increasingly canalized and rigidified with age, so that the older individual has available fewer avenues for flexibility, some investigators have put forth an alternative point of view. In this latter view, the young child is a prisoner of his abilities and gifts, which may exist in exquisite form, but also lie in splendid isolation from one another, unable to be productively linked. While the mature individual is able to gain conscious access to his various modular abilities and to mobilize them for diverse ends. According to Anne Brown and Paul Rosen, two psychologists who have pondered this issue, once a new ability has been brought to consciousness, it can then be applied to all kinds of diverse programs and ends. Naturally, such a bubbling up to consciousness is less likely to occur in the 2-year-old than in the 20-year-old. Here, then, is a view that may account for the striking originality and flexibility found among at least some adults. As far as I am concerned, these two positions are not necessarily in conflict. Perhaps the ability to master a particular program in a smooth and effortless way is easier in earlier life. But the ability to mobilize this ability and put it to fresh uses may be the prerogative of the developed individual. In any case, the issue of when abilities are flexible and or accessible, as opposed to canalized and or inaccessible, proves vital for anyone concerned with educational interventions in the symbolic domains. A second controversial area concerns the existence of stages of development and the extent to which such stages may be linked to certain ages. As articulated by Piaget, the strongest position here holds that there are indeed discrete stages of development, which are qualitatively different from one another and stipulate characteristic worldviews. Moreover, as part of this point of view, there is the frequent rider that the stages of development are age-linked, and that, if the child does not pass smoothly through a stage at the appropriate age, his subsequent development will be forever askew. The past decade has not been friendly to the strong version of the stage hypothesis. It turns out that young children are capable of many operations once withheld from them, and that, under certain circumstances, adults must pass through stages of learning paralleling those realized by the young child. It is difficult, in the light of these findings, to adhere to a rigid view of the stage theory. Nonetheless, in my own view, there is still utility in recognizing different mental organizations associated with different levels of understanding. For example, in the picture of symbolic development I have rendered, and it is the foolhardy optimist who, confident that certain symbolic skills can be easily acquired by the adult, would withhold crucial symbolic experiences from children. To be sure, adults can attain mastery in many areas, sometimes even more quickly than children can, but mature individuals may well be using different kinds of abilities and strategies, including ones to which they have conscious access. There may well be certain facets of the material, such as accent or connotation in language, that the adult will never be able to negotiate as successfully as the naive child. Returning for a moment to the argument of earlier chapters, I find it most plausible that each domain of intelligence and, by extension, each symbolic domain, harbors its own series of steps through which the individual can advance. There is no reason to think that these intelligences or symbol systems align with complete consistency alongside one another. That kind of general stage notion has almost surely been discredited. Nor is it reasonable to assume that the limits and the possibilities of adult learning are the same across diverse symbol systems. Rather, it seems more productive at this point to look for stage-like sequences and for age-linked limitations in each of the separate intelligences and to see whether any systematic patterns can be observed. It is equally important to examine putative stage sequences across different cultures to see, for example, whether the steps of development in drawing or dance are revealingly different, depending upon the cultural context in which they unfold. Only after such careful empirical work will it be opportune to return to more general issues, such as the utility of stage concepts altogether, and the relationships that may obtain between learning by children and learning by adults. A final controversial issue pertains both to the range of abilities or potentials that one can find within a population, and to the extent to which that range can be affected by environmental manipulations. This is a classical dilemma. Scholars of a hereditarian persuasion generally believe in fairly wide individual differences, which cannot be much affected by environmental manipulations. Those of an empiricist or environmentalist persuasion tend to minimize differences among individuals and to feel that whatever differences may exist lend themselves readily to reduction or intensification. Of course, it is possible to find hereditarians who believe in only small differences among individuals, as well as to find empiricists who are impressed by the large, initial, or culturally formed differences among individuals as well. What is striking is that, with the passage of time and the accumulation of mountains of information, most disputants remain committed to their original position. Not even the demonstrations that a normal college student can increase his short-term memory tenfold, or that most differences in school performance can be virtually eliminated by tutoring, or that seemingly average Japanese children can become violin virtuosos, suffice to convince the committed hereditarian that individual differences can be fully dissolved by judicious intervention. Indeed, even I myself confess to being unpersuaded that there are not inborn differences, sometimes ones of great moment, and that at least some of them can never be erased. What recent research has shown, virtually incontrovertibly, is that whatever differences may initially appear, early intervention and consistent training can play a decisive role in determining the individual's ultimate level of performance. If a particular behavior is considered important by a culture, if considerable resources are devoted to it, if the individual himself is motivated to achieve in that area, and if proper means of crystallizing and learning are made available, nearly every normal individual can attain impressive competence in an intellectual or a symbolic domain. Conversely, and perhaps more obviously, even the most innately talented individual will founder without some positive supporting environment. Discovery of an individual's inherent intellectual profile, which I believe may be possible, need not serve, then, as a means of pigeonholing the individual or of consigning him to an intellectual junk heap. Rather, such discovery should provide a means for assuring that every individual has available to him as many options as possible, as well as the potential to achieve competence in whatever fields he and his society deem important. In alluding to the roles valued by a society, I approach the question of the ways in which intelligences are ultimately to be deployed. It is evident that, with few exceptions, societies are not interested in pure intellectual competences. There are few occupational roles that the idiot savant of linguistic, logical, or bodily intelligence can perform. Rather, in nearly all socially useful roles, one sees at work an amalgam of intellectual and symbolic competences, working toward the smooth accomplishment of valued goals. In a sense, then, my description of individual intelligences, and even of the early stages of symbolic development, is a fiction, one chiefly useful for scientific purposes. Neither the several intelligences nor the various streams exist in pristine isolation. Rather, such ideal systems are always encountered in a cultural setting, one that comes to exert decisive control of their developmental course. And so, in this present study, I have crossed a conceptual Rubicon. From this point on, I shall, with rare exceptions, be concerned with how human proclivities and skills unfold within a supportive cultural context. Especially in a complex society, there is clearly no one-to-one correspondence between intellectual strengths and social roles. To begin with, the individual with impressive ability in one form of intelligence can use it to a number of ends. Thus, the individual in our society with well-developed spatial skills might end up as engineer or architect, or equally as artist or sculptor. Likewise, an individual with well-developed interpersonal skills could end up as teacher or social worker, minister or magician. An intellectual strength opens up possibilities. A combination of intellectual strengths spawns a multiplicity of possibilities. From the opposite perspective, it is equally evident that a valued cultural role can be filled by individuals who present distinctive intellectual profiles. Take, for example, the role of lawyer in our society. There is room in and at the top of the legal profession for the individual who has outstanding linguistic skills, one who can excel in the writing of briefs, the phrasing of convincing arguments, the recall of facts from hundreds of cases, and the like. There is room also for the individual with highly developed interpersonal skills, one who can speak eloquently in the courtroom, skillfully interview witnesses and prospective jurors, and display an engaging personality, the so-called society lawyer. Finally, there is room for the individual with highly developed logical skills, one who is able to analyze a situation, to isolate its underlying factors, and to follow a tortuous chain of reasoning to its ultimate conclusion. Still in the area of legal reasoning, the forms themselves can be differentiated in various ways. Analysts of the legal profession like Paul Freund and Edward Levi designate a variety of reasoning abilities that can be used by lawyers, including reasoning by analogy, pursuing lengthy syllogistic chains, engaging in dialectical thinking, finding the best precedent, overlooking marginal details, and testing hypotheses in the manner of a scientist. Lawyers may begin from first principles, from earlier cases, or from the conclusion that a client wants one to reach. They may rely on reflection, authority, or intuition, the recognition of a solution through instantaneous, non-reflective means. Members of the legal profession also differ in whether they rely on straight logical deduction, in whether they value elegance in presentation, and in whether they are preoccupied with ethical issues or overwhelmed by personal ties to a client. It is obvious even from this brief excerpt that the mere evocation of logical mathematical reasoning is too simple to account for the kinds and the combinations of reasoning skills that are cultivated in lawyers. Doubtless, a similar differentiated analysis can be carried out for each of the roles within a complex society, ranging from performers to physicians, from scientists to salesmen. Moreover, once one begins to consider combinations of intelligences, one encounters an even larger set of ways in which an individual can be competent. Thus, it seems evident that a lawyer is well served if he has highly developed linguistic, logical, and interpersonal intelligences, though it is less obvious how musical or kinesthetic intelligence would bear on his practice. And the number of ways in which linguistic, logical, and interpersonal intelligences can be combined in effective legal practice is staggering even to contemplate. As we toy with these sets of intelligences, we can readily see how various combinations might be exploited by different kinds of practitioner, both in our culture and in others. Taking the lawyer as the paradigm of a combination of logical and linguistic intellectual abilities, we might contrast this mix of intelligences with several other couplets. The skilled politician may combine linguistic and social intelligence to a high degree but have relatively little need for logical ability. The grace involved in kinesthetic intelligence might prove an asset as well. As for public figures in other, less legalistically oriented societies, it is possible that social factors might again emerge as more important than logical ones. According to Stanley Tambia, for example, advocates in African societies are less concerned with whether their statements can be disproved and more concerned with their persuasive powers. In the case of the theatrical performer, a premium may be placed on linguistic and bodily intelligence. On the other hand, I am not persuaded that interpersonal intelligence per se figures prominently in the skillful execution of dramatic roles, though it may be important for a director who must orchestrate large numbers of individuals. Other combinations of intelligences lead in yet different directions. The individual with strongly developed logical, mathematical, and spatial abilities has the gifts to become a physical scientist. The logical abilities may prove relatively more important for the theoretically oriented individual. The spatial abilities for the experimental scientist. An individual equipped with these abilities, along with a combination of linguistic and social skills, would make an ideal administrator of a large scientific laboratory. Paradoxically, this latter combination of abilities might also be useful for the sorcerer in a traditional society, for he too needs skills in language, interpersonal relations, and logic, though perhaps in a different mix. It is tempting to regard the particular intelligences as elements in a mentalistic chemistry set, and to engage in the cocktail party exercise of analyzing different social roles in terms of their preferred blend of intellectual flavors. I have myself succumbed to this temptation, but I hope I have not obscured the serious point. There is always a dialectic at work between the roles and the functions valued in a culture, on the one hand, and the individual intellectual skills possessed by its inhabitants on the other. The purpose of the professional marketplace or of the personnel director is to effect the most productive match between the demands of various roles and the profiles of specific individuals. One might even speculate that the smoothly functioning societies has found a proper mechanism for affecting this correspondence, or has roles that nearly anyone can fill, while the dysfunctional society is packed with individuals whose intellectual profiles do not jibe with important roles. I would suspect that this kind of mismatch is most likely to occur during periods of rapid change. At such times, a new host of roles, for example, those involved in science and technology, need to be staffed. But the traditional training of individuals has neglected or actively rejected those combinations of intellectual and symbolic skills essential to the effective execution of these newly emerging roles. In this chapter, I have sought to broaden the analyses of earlier parts of the book by showing how our raw intellectual competences constitute the basis on which human symbol-using capacities of the most diverse sort are constructed and then deployed for societal ends. In my view, it is through an understanding of how individuals obtain competence with various symbol systems and learn to fashion diverse symbolic products that we are most likely to gain a better understanding of the means by which one becomes, or fails to become, a productive member of one's community. To elaborate my position, I have put forth one theory of how symbolic development occurs, and have touched as well upon a number of still controversial issues about the form of symbolic development. In the final chapters of this book, I turn to the educational implications of the theory. I am concerned with the ways in which the theory of multiple intelligences might be used to inform, and perhaps alter, policies implemented by people who are responsible for education, childcare, and human development. But now, after having outlined the basic features of the theory, but before leaving the halls of scholarly inquiry for the trenches of educational policy, I shall revisit some major alternative approaches to intelligence and indicate how they appear to differ from my own approach. In no sense is this brief survey meant to be a thorough discussion of how my theory relates to other extant theories. That task would take another book. Indeed, I have cited the names of individual scholars solely for illustrative purposes. But some indication of the form that such a critical document might take would not be inopportune at the present time. I begin with those views most directly connected to the concept of intelligence as it is ordinarily employed in psychology. Classically, as I mentioned in Chapter 2, there are two major views concerning the construct of intelligence. One set of hedgehog scholars sympathetic to the notion of a general intelligence, G, like Charles Spearman and Arthur Jensen, and an opposing set sympathetic to a pluralistic view of intelligence, such as those foxes who take a multifactorial approach to intellect like L. L. Thurstone and J. P. Guilford. It will be obvious that the conclusions of MI theory are much closer to those of the foxes, and are not compatible with the beliefs of those who hold to a strong G view of intelligence. My own analysis suggests that apparent support for G comes chiefly from the fact that most tests of intelligence are paper and pencil exercises that rely heavily on linguistic and logical mathematical abilities. Hence, individuals strong in these two areas will perform well on tests of general intelligence, in contrast to individuals whose strengths lie elsewhere. Schools cherish these capacities for mental manipulation, which is why G can predict success in school with some accuracy. Where then does MI theory depart from the multifactorial point of view? First of all, the latter does not question the existence of general horizontal abilities, like perception and memory, which may cut across different content areas. Indeed, the multifactorial point of view exhibits a studied indifference to this issue because some factors are indeed horizontal forms of memory or perception, while others reflect strict content areas like spatial ability. Second, the multifactorial point of view does not make intellectual contact with biology but is strictly empirical, the result of correlations among test scores and of nothing more. Third, and perhaps most crucial, the multifactorial approach does not allow one to sample the range of intellectual competences I have considered here. So long as one is content to use paper and pencil or brief interviewing techniques, lasting minutes rather than hours, there is simply no way to sample an individual's competence in such areas as bodily expression, musical ability, or the forms of personal intelligence. Thus, while laudably more pluralistic than the G school, the multifactorial approach provides only that extremely partial glimpse of intelligence that reflects the Western scientific ethos. The work of two subsequent schools, the Piagetian and the information processing approaches, represents to my mind a step forward in scientific power, but not necessarily any progress in the analysis of intellectual profiles. The Piagetian school is more closely attuned to the child's daily activities and skills, thereby providing a more holistic and veridical notion of his intellectual capacities. An interest in strategies, in telltale errors, in the relations among bodies of knowledge is to be applauded, and the clinical interviewing method perfected by Piaget is an innovation of great utility for the student of intellectual growth. Yet the classical structuralist view of intellect is even narrower than that held by the intelligence test makers, and in fact, is restricted almost completely to logical mathematical thinking. Perhaps for that reason it remains studiously blind to content. The clear assumption obtains that mental operations unfold in the same fashion across diverse materials. In the work of Piaget's follower Kurt Fischer, there is a welcome recognition that development may not occur at the same rate in diverse domains. That, in fact, in Piaget's terminology, décalage, loosely speaking, variation, across domains is the rule rather than the exception. Still, there remains the conviction that development occurs in the same sequenced fashion across all domains, and there is insufficient sensitivity to the possibility that the course of development in various content domains might be decisively different. It is poignant that Piaget, a biologist by training who believed that he was studying the biology of cognition, should have been so insensitive to diverse biological proclivities in the cognitive realm. Information processing. Psychology represents an advance over Piaget in the sense that more careful attention is paid to the actual processes by which individuals solve problems from moment to moment. The meticulous task analysis that is part and parcel of this approach has helped us to realize that many of Piaget's apparent stages and sequences are artifacts of particular task configurations, and that younger individuals possess many abilities that Piaget had mistakenly withheld from them. But because information processing is more of an approach than a theory, it has been of little help in forging a coherent picture of human intellectual abilities. One can find in this approach some comfort for the notion that all problems are solved in essentially the same way, but virtually equal comfort for the notion of total task specificity, where every task requires its own abilities and there is no interesting transfer. By the same token, one finds support for the notion that the child processes information in just the way that adults do, but simply possesses less knowledge. But virtually equivalent support for the notion that the child has a less tenacious short-term memory, a less adequate encoding capacity, and other qualitative divergences from the information processing machinery of the adult. The very fact that information processing psychology can yield such diverse conclusions may signify only the immaturity of the field. However, to my mind, it may reflect deeper lacks, the absence of a biological perspective on the nature of the tasks that are employed, as well as the lack of a theory of what constitutes the domain under scrutiny. Instead, one has the vague model of the child as a kind of computational device, a model that has certain advantages, but that, like all models, is only partial, and, as Alan Allport has suggested, depending upon the kind of computer one selects, and the analysis of the computer one embraces, one will secure a very different picture of what the information processor is like. All the approaches reviewed until now center on the individual, seeing him in Cartesian fashion as almost entirely alone, engaged in sophisticated problem-solving in an environment that plays little formative role in his skills, his attitudes, or his ultimate performance. This perspective is taken to an extreme in the work of Noam Chomsky, and to some extent in that of his colleague, Jerry Fodor. Here the child is regarded as a collection of separate computational devices, each of which unfolds according to its own preordained and preformed laws, with little influence of any sort, except triggering from the environment. Indeed, Chomsky rejects traditional notions of learning and development. In their stead, he nominates a model of intellectual unfolding that borrows heavily from embryology. It should be obvious that I have some sympathy with Chomsky's point of view, feeling that it serves as a needed corrective to uncritically empiricist accounts of knowledge acquisition spawned during earlier eras. And Chomsky's and Fodor's account of domain squares well with mine, though I fail to locate any attempt in his work to indicate how a domain might be defined and delimited in a systematic way. Where Chomsky's view seems unforgivably weak, however, is in its failure to countenance the ways in which an intelligence must unfold in an environment filled with meanings and interpretations. There is simply no recognition of how various symbolic capacities develop and interact, or of how the human biological substrate can be exploited to achieve many different ends, depending upon the particular values and functions of the society under consideration. By denying the role of culture, or at any rate by failing to confer upon it any importance, Chomsky fashions a theory that is completely skeletal. We are left with no way of understanding how a society accomplishes its work, of how or even why education takes place, of why young children differ from one another, and of why they differ even more from adults in various societies. In other words, the superstructure is completely missing, even though the infrastructure may have been inferred with intuitive brilliance. The superstructure dominates the attention of another group of analysts, those concerned with the effects of culture on the development of the individual. Chief representatives of this tradition include Michael Cole, Sylvia Scribner, Jean Lave, and their psychologically oriented colleagues, as well as Clifford Geertz, the anthropologist interested in symbolic systems. These scholars direct almost all of their attention to the components of the surrounding culture, contending that it is through a careful analysis of the culture, with its different forms and forces, that the proper account of the acquisition of cognitive capacities is most likely to be found. Geertz quotes with approval. Gilbert Ryle's caution that the mind is not even a metaphorical place. On the contrary, the chessboard, the platform, the scholar's desk, the judge's bench, the lorry driver's seat, the studio, and the football field are among its places. And he himself adds, men without culture would be monstrosities with some useful instincts, few identifiable feelings, and no intelligence. No doubt reacting to the perceived excessive mentalism of traditional philosophical approaches, when all mental abilities were conceded directly to the individual, and also to contemporary theorists like Chomsky, who at most pay lip service to culture, these anthropologically oriented commentators underscore the extent to which individuals gain their symbols, their ideas, and their ways of thinking from those around them, and more generally, from the collected wisdom of the culture. In many ways, this anthropological perspective introduces an important new element in the understanding of cognition. For instance, Cole and his colleagues have examined the performances of individuals drawn from several cultures on standard tests of intelligence and reasoning, and have concluded that most apparent differences in performances can be explained by the different previous experiences of the subjects. When these experiences are taken into account, and suitable alterations are made in testing procedures, most apparent differences evaporate. And indeed, individuals from putatively less developed cultures may even perform at a superior level. Certainly, there is no need to introduce any notions of inherent ethnic differences. The general argument put forth by these investigators runs as follows. While the products of reasoning and the kinds of information to which individuals are sensitive may differ significantly across cultures, the processes of thinking are the same everywhere. Cultures mobilize these basic information processing capacities, these core intelligences, and fashion them to their own ends. As a further part of this reorientation of cognitive theories, scholars like Cole stress the extent to which every individual's mental powers are absorbed from the outside, first being constituted in the knowledge and actions of other persons, and only gradually becoming internalized into one's own representational capacities. We count and we write, not because we have ourselves developed in certain ways, but because we have seen other individuals make use of these notations. Nor is this process ever completed. No matter what the society, the individual always depends on other intellectual contributions by other individuals in order to carry out his daily tasks and to ensure his own survival. How many individuals are truly self-sufficient, even in a cognitive sense? The answer underscores the extent to which even one's own mind is perennially dependent upon the many other minds around. Naturally, this anthropologically oriented approach does not display much sympathy for endogenous developmental trajectories. Nor is there any need to posit a series of relatively autonomous mental computers. The individual will perform as required in the culture in which he happens to live. The belief in autonomous mental components would be criticized from at least two perspectives. First of all, the autonomous theory proceeds as if initial development were regulated by factors internal to the organism, whereas in actuality, the culture and its interpretive mechanisms are present from the first. Second, the autonomous theory tends to assume that the range of possible developmental outcomes is sharply canalized, if not actually fixed in advance. A more culturally oriented approach stresses the likelihood that certain as yet undiscovered cultures might perform operations that we cannot even envision, or that cultures evolving in the future will also mold our intellectual proclivities in unanticipated directions. All of these insights seem to be well worth absorbing into a comprehensive account of human cognition. But what is missing from this analysis through anthropological lenses is a recognition of the ways in which, even treated in the most appropriate and equivalent ways, individuals within a culture can still differ significantly from one another. In intellectual strengths, in ability to learn, in ultimate use of their faculties, in originality and creativity. I see no way, short of a more psychological and biological approach, of dealing with this variable of difference in performance. Such an environmentally oriented approach also overlooks both the extent to which the individual may progress in a field, using only modest help from the surroundings, and how a few isolated individuals can go on to truly remarkable accomplishments. In a sense, the approach of these anthropologically oriented scholars is most suitable for explaining how the average individual in an average situation functions, and perhaps gives a misleading notion of how average all of us, in fact, are. Somewhere between the Chomskyan stress on individuals, with their separate unfolding mental faculties, the Piagetian view of the developing organism passing through a uniform sequence of stages, and the anthropological attention to the formative effects of the cultural environment, it ought to be possible to forge a productive middle ground, a position that takes seriously the nature of innate intellectual proclivities, the heterogeneous processes of development in the child, and the ways in which these are shaped and transformed by the particular practices and values of culture. It is this effort that I have undertaken in this book. It must be stressed, therefore, that I have relied heavily on the aforementioned authors and on many other psychologists of development who have been interested in educational issues. In an earlier chapter, I stated that my own view on the centrality of symbol systems and on the need for an analysis in terms of cultural domains grows out of collaborative efforts with Gavriel Salomon, David Olson, and most especially David Feldman. I should underscore again my indebtedness to these contemporary scholars of development and education. And I should add to this list the name of Jerome Bruner, who, more than any other developmental psychologist of our time, has been interested in education and has proved sensitive to the range of issues discussed in the latter part of this book. The child's biological heritage, his preferred avenues of development, and the formative effects of the culture, including the role of tools, symbol systems, media, and other processes in the devising and the transmission of knowledge. I owe a large debt to Jerome Bruner for attuning me, as he has so many others, to this nexus of issues. I have now laid out the major tenets of multiple intelligence theory, indicated some of its major weaknesses as I see them, and related the current version of the theory to other competing perspectives on the intellect. The time has come to see whether this framework can help us to understand better the processes of education as they have taken place in the past and as they might possibly be refashioned in the future. This task will first require some consideration of the various ways in which knowledge has, in fact, been transmitted throughout the course of human history. And it is to this fascinating but little understood issue that I shall next turn. That's it for today. If you enjoyed this video, you might want to check our link in the description, where you'll find Gardner's book summary and many other fundamental persuasion books in different languages. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more psychologic and marketing content. See you in the next one.